Iran was one of the original oil exporting countries.
They had gotten control of any productive capacity that Iran had.
The Shah's trying to give pieces of the country away, basically to cover their debts.
It was the single largest source of revenue for the British Empire. And it was at that stage that the Americans stepped into the game.
It was the fear of the United States that we would lose the power of the British to keep control in Southeast Asia and in the Middle East.
There's a strong sense that the Shah is now, America's man.
But it was this test case for the CIA and a lot of other third world countries.
Gets everybody thinking, okay, we're good at this. We're good at regime change. We can do this over and over again.
Khomeini and his network were really agitating.
There was a sense among many of these groups, like, we didn't sign on for this.
But anyone who spoke against it was basically liquidated.
We supported Saddam because we saw Iran as the worst of the two evils.
And so I think it was sort of beware, but be prepared to take advantage of the situation as it emerges.
That might trigger a broader confrontation.
But there are really no heroes in Iran.
Virtually everything that people understand about Iran is false. I mean, the entire narrative.
It's rare that you see an administration come in and just yank the football back, basically.
In Tehran, there is a regime with its back to the wall.
We could very well be in a very messy war.
The Ayatollah Khomeini was dead, but his Islamic revolution continued. The United States was trying to keep a global empire running smoothly, and in the Middle East, that put it at odds with Iran and its proxy groups like Lebanese Hezbollah. Everyone in the Muslim world, from the conservative Saudis to the modernist Turks, were willing to deal with the West in exchange for opulence and peace. Everyone, except Iran. Prior U.S. meddling in the country, together with its more recent support for Saddam and his war of aggression against them, meant that Khomeini's Iran would remain uniquely anti-American. Following the Ayatollah's death, the path forward became far less clear. After Khomeini and a short-lived campaign to replace the position of supreme leader with a slightly more democratic Council of Elders, ultimate power in Iran fell to the country's then president and Khomeini's chosen successor, the incredibly similarly named Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Khamenei had been the elected president during the Iran-Iraq War, and as a more typical public figure than Khomeini, his ascent to supreme leader made the elected president far more relevant than ever before. The position of supreme leader still technically had total power within the system, but unlike Khomeini, Khamenei had once been elected by the people, so they were used to critically appraising his beliefs as those of a public servant. This same people soon elected a relatively moderate new president and political veteran named Rafsanjani, and together with Khamenei's slightly less hardline persona, this triggered hope around the world that tensions with the United States could be on their way to easing. Iran was still ruled by hardliners, but they were hardliners who believed that Iran had no path to success that did not emphasize diplomacy with the modern world. In the United States, a new election also shifted power between leaders, but the victory of George H.W. Bush meant that American power stayed within the country's conservative wing. The Bush administration had an unusually high concentration of for-the-time unconventional thinkers who were still in the process of codifying the works of philosopher Leo Strauss into a new form of American foreign policy. Their philosophy would come to be known as Neoconservatism, defined by the evolved Reaganite belief that the superiority of American values amounted to a moral obligation to spread those values around the world. In particular, they focused on Israel as an avatar of American culture, making its enemies their own by their very definition.
Well, the neoconservatives were, for the most part, evolved pro-Israelis. They were predominantly supporters of Israel, and they were much infused with the sort of, if you will, aggressive posture of Israel vis-a-vis its neighbors. The idea that these neighbors could not be trusted and that power ultimately had to have a military expression, and that American and Israeli interests were one.
There were several early, powerful neoconservatives in government during this period, including John McCain, Newt Gingrich, Dick Cheney, and Paul Wolfowitz. Bush also turned to the world of think tanks more deeply than any president before him, bringing hardcore ideologues like John Bolton out of unrelated arms of the government and quite suddenly into the realm of foreign policy. They were simultaneously idealistic and cynical, embracing a distinctly Reaganite sort of soaring rhetoric and historic perspective, along with a Kissinger-like willingness to take virtually any global action that advanced U.S. power.
I define neoconservatism as a movement that believed that the political system had drifted into far too soft a line and was ready to use really kind of hard tactics, including deception, to move the ball in the direction of a really hard line.
In his memoir, Bolton summed up this new group's disdain for the culture of global diplomacy. Quote, "State careerists are schooled in accommodation and compromise with foreigners, rather than aggressive advocacy of U.S. interests, which might inconveniently disrupt the serenity of diplomatic exchanges, not to mention dinner parties and receptions."
I think of neoconservatism as this, general idea that the U.S. needs to exert its might on the world stage, that this is an American moment, and, since the end of the Cold War, there's no rival, and so the U.S. can reshape the world as it sees fit through military might. It's very much tied to this idea of American empire and American hegemony and making sure that there is no rival to American power.
By 1990, this mentality was in at least partial control of the mechanisms of foreign policy at the Bush White House, and the Iranians knew it. Though by this time the Shahs were clearly gone for good, and Iranian politics seemed to be veering at least slightly liberal, fear of U.S. designs, and in particular the machinations of the CIA, was still at a fever pitch. Partially that was because the Iranian government intentionally stoked these fears, and partly it was because of the growing economic impact of American-led international sanctions. Unemployment rose and the middle class shrank as Iranian businesses were kept from selling their goods or even buying their supplies internationally, and the overall quality of life fell dramatically. Increasingly, Iranians began to fear an outright U.S. invasion as Bush continued to paint Iran as a rogue nation well after Khomeiни's death.
Like, Iran directly kind of mano-a-mano challenged the United States. They took our embassy. They kept our people hostage for 444 days. That's for us to deal with, and we don't have to listen to the United Nations. We don't have to listen to, any other international players. We've been harmed. We're the aggrieved party. We've been attacked, and we have the right to kind of strike back on our own.
The Bush administration publicly told Iran that, quote, "goodwill begets goodwill," and suggested that if Iran arranged for Hezbollah to release all of their remaining prisoners, that the U.S. would consider helping with sanctions and even paying reparations for the downing of Iran Air Flight 655. Hezbollah released the hostages, and in a move that would be cited by Iranian scholars for decades to come, the United States provided nothing in return. It was a bitter lesson for Khamenei's new nation, but in America, they consoled themselves that the only people they had betrayed were kidnappers and terrorists, or those who fund them.
Again, Iran has been isolated. It's been isolated for a very long time through the efforts of Western governments, through the efforts of governments in the region who were worried about the revolution kind of spreading over, spreading into their own populace and, giving people funny ideas. And so instead of, in many respects, cultivating kind of traditional alliances, the Iranians have sought out these groups that in some cases are like-minded. You know, Hezbollah, for example, is a 12er Shia kind of movement. In some cases, there's sort of enemy of my enemy relationships, which I think you could argue these are sort of not natural fits from an ideological perspective, but they have common enemies, and so that makes the basis for a relationship.
Then, Saddam finally snapped. He was angry with his oil-rich Arab neighbors for pressing him on $30 billion in loans given to fight the Iran-Iraq War, believing that they owed him that support since he provided a barrier between them and Iranian influence. Saddam began to threaten to invade his tiny but oil-rich southern neighbor in Kuwait and simply take their oil fields for himself. And as this crisis loomed, the US ambassador to Iraq famously told him that the United States has, quote, no opinion on the Arab-Arab conflicts, like your border disagreement with Kuwait. Many believe that the Bush administration intentionally baited Saddam into invading Kuwait to justify a US incursion in response. But whatever the American intention, in 1990, Saddam came to the conclusion that his old benefactors in Washington would let him away with invading yet another neighboring oil state. He was making a reckless bet that the world would simply blink and allow the invasion without any real response. But his continuing aggressiveness finally pushed his Arab neighbors too far. Unwilling to let a single country control such a large proportion of the world's oil, they united behind an incursion led by the Bush White House. This new anti-Saddam coalition had a backbone of American air power flying off of aircraft carriers and out of new military bases it negotiated to build in northern Saudi Arabia. The bases caused a minor uprising among conservative Saudis, who saw the move as a state-sanctioned invasion by Christian crusaders, but the Saudi royal family placated them with promises that the bases would be removed the instant Saddam was pushed out of Kuwait. And as always, it also placated the population with yet more freedom for conservative Islam. From these bases, the US provided Iran with a stark reminder of just how advanced the American military truly was. Iranians had just spent most of a decade making it clear that the overall abilities of the Iraqi military were very similar to their own. And in the Gulf War, the United States took the yardstick represented by the Iraqi military and hammered it into the ground. In a matter of days, the US attack had forced every single Iraqi unit to run, surrender, or face utter destruction. Save for a lucky Iraqi missile strike on a US barracks, killing soldiers in their sleep, the heavily air-power-driven American coalition took virtually no casualties whatsoever. Leading U.S. General Storeman Norman Schwarzkopf communicated the scale of the victory to reporters in a presentation that would come to be known as the mother of all briefings.
The next 2 days went exactly like we thought they would go. These have been the U.S. casualties to date, the total being as shown here. Next. Hold on for 1 second. 1 second is up.
The Gulf War gave the U.S. a chance to sort of flex its muscles in the immediate aftermath. You know, the Cold War sort of ending, and the United States is emerging as the global superpower. And the Gulf War, they gave it a chance. This is something, you know, you hear neoconservatives talk about sometimes, the idea of, you know, it's not a bad thing for the United States to just pick a country and pummel it every so often just to show the rest of the world that we're tough and we mean business.
The sheer dominance of the US force was shocking to Iran, both the people and the military. Iran had always assumed that it could provide just the sort of human barrier that had been so successful against Saddam, and that while they couldn't beat the US, that they could provide enough of a casualty-laden quagmire that the US also could not beat them. With the utter destruction of Saddam's army taking place virtually by the hour, the US attacked the core of that premise and put into Iranian minds the crucial question: what, if anything, could give them the ability to fend off such a disproportionate power? Bush eventually held US forces back from deposing Saddam, both to avoid taking responsibility for Iraq and because it was assumed that if American troops came too close to Baghdad, that Saddam would finally use his stockpiles of chemical weapons against them.
I can report to the nation, aggression is defeated, the war is over. And this I promise you, for all that Saddam has done to his own people, to the Kuwaitis, and to the entire world, Saddam and those around him are accountable.
Leaving Saddam in power also kept him at Iran's doorstep, and even as the U.S. withdrew its troops from Kuwait in the hundreds of thousands, the military bases it had established in Saudi Arabia remained. Iran had not only been thoroughly unmanned by the total defeat of its great rival, it had also been left facing yet another place from which America could carry out a remote first strike without endangering a single soldier. An increasing number of Iranians believed that nuclear weapons were a necessity, but before his death, Khomeini had left the country with a conflicted set of policies on the subject. He reportedly issued an internal government fatwa against their development in the late 1980s, but he also oversaw the formation of relationships that would ensure future development of nuclear weapons remained possible overall. Abdul Qadir Khan, popularly known as AQ Khan, was a Pakistani scientist working for a company called Urenco to develop an improved Soviet nuclear centrifuge. To separate isotopes of gaseous uranium by the incredibly small differences in their atomic weights, these centrifuges must spin at 100,000 RPM or more, meaning the exterior of the cylinder moves at well beyond Mach 2. Khan's expertise in metallurgy made him invaluable to the company's quest for a metal that was both sufficiently strong and light to let the centrifuges run even faster, and he worked his way up the ranks as a gifted scientist. Eventually, Urenco gave him access to the complete blueprints for the centrifuges, highly classified Soviet intelligence even among the team's own members. About a year later, India carried out its first nuclear test, putting Khan's home nation of Pakistan at a severe disadvantage. And so, Khan took the company's plans, posted a physical letter to the Pakistani Prime Minister, and set out for home. Khan would go on to help Pakistan establish a successful nuclear program in part by selling and trading atomic secrets around the world. His trade in illicit knowledge assisted Libya, North Korea, and China with their nuclear ambitions in exchange for funding or technology to help with his own. Iran, which had no nuclear program following the collapse of its nuclear power industry, was one of several countries to acquire the plans to Urenco's centrifuges, bringing them a step closer to at least beginning to build a nuclear weapon. It was a distant dream, with billions of dollars and potentially decades of work still to come, but the sheer size of the US threat seemed to make the investment worth it. The Khan network also offered to sell Iran the secret to casting uranium metal, a crucial step in creating the core of a nuclear weapon, but Iran reportedly refused. Khamenei restarted the civilian nuclear power industry and secured a deal for Russia to renew construction on the Bushehr plant. But the plans for AQ Khan's weapons-focused centrifuges sat unused. It was not until well into the 1990s, as Iran's nuclear power industry grew substantially, that the country began to secretly expand its enrichment facilities to allow the construction of a nuclear bomb.
It was quite natural for Iran then to say, well, we can't be left out of this, that we shall have to carry on the development and intensify the development of nuclear weapons. It became apparent that countries that develop nuclear weapons, of which the best case was North Korea, become immune to retaliation from the United States.
Meanwhile, global trade with Iran was steadily increasing. It seemed that the world was slowly beginning to adjust to the existence of the Islamic Republic, and Bush was becoming supremely unpopular at home due to domestic missteps. A new presidential rival was rising with a more compassionate view of the world, just as American business came around to the idea of Iranian customers. Iran's government hoped that this would be a new day for American foreign policy and a reevaluation of their actions versus those of any other Middle Eastern dictatorship. Then, Bill Clinton took office and went on to ignore Iran almost completely.
Today, as an old order passes, the new world is more free, but less stable. Communism's collapse has called forth old animosities and new dangers. Clearly, America must continue to lead the world we did so much to make.
The American liberals that had elected him had no shortage of criticisms for conservatism at home, but beyond a generalized wish for the world to be at peace, they lacked any concrete theory of global American power. They did believe that American dominance should be maintained, but had no concept of how this should be achieved or how that dominance should be used. And so, despite a huge shift in the political culture at the White House, the status quo in the State Department continued.
Well, the Clinton administration became caught up with the Oslo process, which landed on the desk virtually the day Clinton became president. And that then became the preeminent focus of the Clinton administration. And so the dual containment, that is to say the policy towards Iran and the Gulf more generally, was sort of just to keep this under control, while in the meantime, the United States then dealt with the Palestinian-Israeli problem. So the Clinton administration didn't really change things dramatically in any way vis-a-vis Iran. Iran had managed to stave off the Iraqis and the rest of the Arabs and the United States. And so the best thing was just to keep it all quiet.
Instead of either adopting or opposing a neoconservative foreign policy, Clinton simply declined to articulate or implement anything new of his own. He exiled the more outspoken Bush-era loyalists like Bolton and Wolfowitz back to the world of think tanks and private business, but after doing so, he did not meaningfully change anything that had defined their influence over the country. He continued the American strategy of dual containment and cited Hezbollah as the main reason to ratchet economic sanctions on Iran higher than ever, including a total ban on all trade and investment with Iran, a far harsher punishment than any Bush-era sanction.
The sanctions have sort of forced Khamenei to embrace a sense of it's us against the world. Khomeini really played into this kind of sense that it's Iran against the world, and we've got to come together, which is something you do kind of naturally in time of war. These U.S. sanctions that have sort of stifled the Iranian economy and cut Iran off from the rest of the world in many respects have resurrected that feeling, I think, and allowed Khamenei to sort of play to those same sentiments among the Iranian people. He talks a lot about what he calls the resistance economy, which is an entirely self-sufficient Iranian economy that doesn't depend on the rest of the world for anything, which is sort of, a far-fetched idea, but the goal is to sort of separate from the rest of the world so that they're not vulnerable to U.S. pressure and they're not vulnerable to foreign pressure.
The neoconservatives, however, largely out of government at this point, were beginning to look at the order of things in the aftermath of the Soviet Union.
These think tanks were well-funded, particularly from the right. They had neocon connections, and they played an increasing role then in influencing American foreign policy decision-making, precisely at the time that the power and influence of the State Department was beginning to wane.
In 1992, the premier conservative think tank, the American Enterprise Institute, produced a theory called the Clash of Civilizations. This idea claimed that future wars would not occur between nation-states, but between cultural groups. With the Cold War and global communism slowly fading into memory, such a view could only be in reference to a single rival culture, the Islamic world.
In almost every part of the world, religion has moved in to fill this gap, often in the form of movements which are labeled fundamentalist, and such movements are found in Western Christianity, Judaism, Orthodox Christianity, and Hinduism, as well as in Islam. The unsecularization of the world, George Weigel has remarked, is one of the dominant social facts in the late 20th century. And this revival of religion provides a basis for identity and commitment that transcends national boundaries and yet unites civilizations.
I think it does kind of feed into the mentality that the U.S. needs to be aggressive and, exert itself, particularly in the Middle East, and, have a heavy military footprint there. I also think it's kind of nonsense. There's a lot of differences within the so-called Western world as there is in the Muslim world.
There is also the assertiveness that you take note of, I think, I mean, I may be reading your book wrong, of Islamic civilization in its
Islamic
own area.
peoples, yes.
Islamic peoples.
Right.
And is that likely to lead to a conflict in which the United States cannot stay out of?
Well, I don't think it's likely to lead to any major conflict. One of the distinctive characteristics of Islam as a civilization today is that there is no single dominant core Islamic state. Islam is very divided. Muslims are fighting themselves. They also are fighting most of their neighbors off and on. And
well, doesn't that erode your theory?
What?
That there's conflict within the Islamic community?
No,
and that there is
it's a refinement to my theory, yeah.
The 1979 Islamic Revolution was still the model for what would come to be known as the Islamic Resurgence. So as the clash of civilizations grew in notoriety, many Americans came to view Iran as the avatar of future conflict. Khamenei's regime made this easier through its own actions, enforcing one of the harshest systems of criminal justice in the world. It consistently carried out the second most executions of any country after China, applying the death penalty for everything from apostasy to drug smuggling. The relatively moderate worldview of urban Iranians was constantly at odds with this sort of puritanical brutality from the regime. It helped to feed a cyclical pattern of radicalization in which fewer Iranians, even liberals, believed that they would ever have productive relations with the world's biggest powers, and thus had no reason not to support more aggressively self-interested moves around their area of the world. For the most part, this meant increasing support for Hezbollah and the development of an increasingly permissive attitude towards its most terroristic behavior, which, in turn, drove Iran further from the international consensus.
Hezbollah is the most important ally of Iran, and for very good reason. It's because Hezbollah's collection of rockets and missiles, which were provided by Iran, is the main deterrent that Iran has to an attack by the United States and Israel. So beginning in 1999, they began to turn these rockets and missiles over to Hezbollah to build up an arsenal, if you will, so that they could threaten to retaliate against Israel if the Israelis attacked either Lebanon or Iran.
The increasing Iranian willingness to suborn useful violence was eventually tested in 1996 when an enormous car bomb exploded in a residential tower in the Saudi Arabian town of Khobar. The tower was home to the US soldiers enforcing the no-fly zone over Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and their continuing presence, contrary to Saudi promises that they would leave immediately after the Gulf War, was a major ongoing source of anger at both the US and the Saudi royals.
We will not rest in our efforts to find who is responsible for this outrage, to pursue them, and to punish them.
Upon hearing that a truck bomb had crashed into a Saudi building full of US soldiers, the world understandably assumed that the perpetrators would be extremist Wahhabi Saudis. But soon the US accused Hezbollah, and through them, their Shia benefactors in Iran. It was treated with skepticism at first, but as time passed, evidence seemed to favor the idea that Iranian-backed Hezbollah agents had indeed been behind the bombing, fueled by a general opposition to any American presence anywhere in the Muslim world. The bombing greatly tainted Iran's image even among liberal Americans and made it far more difficult for Iranians to argue that the US was the only one pushing towards conflict in the Middle East. Then, Iran attempted to take a turn. A well-educated population with a belief that its rightful place was among the world's great nations, Iranians balked at the thought of descending into total isolation through rejection of the outside world. A relatively unknown political candidate named Mohammad Khatami ran on a platform of liberalization, tolerance, and free speech, with explicit reference to the idea that a more open, more modern Iran would be an Iran that could do business with the outside world. The Persian people were used to selling their goods to anyone and everyone who would buy them, and fueled by both genuine liberal sentiment and a wish to end international sanctions, Iran elected Khatami by a landslide. Even conservative religious strongholds voted for Khatami by enormous margins, trusting that their ability to practice their religion would remain untouched, and making it clear that they were not threatened by the basic idea of engagement with the secular modern world. The supreme leader was still there to issue proclamations and protect his vision of the Islamic Revolution, but Khamenei could not ignore the people's deep desire to determine their own fate, or their obvious wish to pursue prosperity through compromise, rather than pride through stubborn resistance. With such a strong mandate, Khamenei immediately began to push his views on the world stage, in particular a theory he called the dialogue of civilizations, in explicit answer to the American clash of civilizations. This view said that the world's most powerful cultural groups could and must come together to find common ground. It was a move calculated to undermine the American narrative of Iran as a fevered warmonger, and many pointed out that it came from the leader of a state that refused to recognize Israel's right to exist.
Mohammad Khatami was the first reformist president in Iran. It just never really meshed up with the Clinton administration. I think it was kind of this pivot point where we could have pursued a diplomatic direction toward Iran.
Khatami did say that despite the official view of Israel, or the Zionist regime as Iranians exclusively refer to it, Jews would be free to practice their religion in Iran, and he took every opportunity to rehabilitate Iran's image in the eyes of the average world citizen, rather than the average professional diplomat.
Such Islam is an enemy to no nation, enemy to no religion. It seeks dialogue, understanding, and peace with all nations. One of the major flaws in the United States foreign policy, which I recently construed as being behind the times, is that they continue to live with Cold War mentality and try to create a perceived enemy.
He arranged an international tournament in wrestling, one of Iran's most popular and traditional sports, and deliberately pumped up coverage to highlight cultural common ground. Iran played the United States in the 1998 FIFA World Cup, winning the game 2-1 after an ostentatious refusal to walk towards the American team during the opening and a much-reported presentation of white roses of peace. The MEC used the opportunity to get its message into a video feed that would be seen all over Iran, but FIFA managed to keep the cameras mostly off of the group's signs. The situation almost evolved into violence, with dozens of armed guards surrounding the MEC area of the stands to prevent disruption of the game. But in the end, the event did help Iran to make inroads with the West. Khatami even began pushing to restore Western tourism to historic Persian sites, which had always been a booming industry. Frustrated with their typical portrayal in the world media, the Iranian people more than played along, beginning a long tradition of telling international media that Iran had no problem with Americans, only with America. It worked wonders, and at the end of 1998, the United Nations preemptively named the year 2001 the Year of Dialogue Among Civilizations. Just 20 days into that year, Americans put a second Bush into the White House. The return of the Bush family to power marked the resurgence of the neoconservative cabal that had helped to cement it in the first place. The younger Bush picked hawks from his father's administration, choosing Dick Cheney as his vice president and Donald Rumsfeld as Secretary of Defense. And they, in turn, brought even more extreme characters like Paul Wolfowitz and John Bolton back to relevance. In Iran, where even average citizens were becoming low-level wonks on American foreign policy, the change did not go unnoticed. Iran defiantly continued to build up Hezbollah, willing to incur the wrath of the international community as it constructed a credible military force on Israel's doorstep, including advanced rockets, missile defenses, and even cyber weapons. Even as Hezbollah funneled Iranian money on to the Palestinian extremist group Hamas, Iranians equivocated by pointing out the long history of American support for equally violent groups around the world, including within Iran itself. Iranians were still animated by fears of an American-led coup attempt or even invasion, but as it turned out, despite a booming economy and seemingly endless global power, it was the United States that should have been on high alert.
It appeared to bank sharply and smash directly, perhaps purposefully, into, oh my goodness, oh God, there's another one.
The attacks of September 11th were carried out by the Sunni extremist group Al-Qaeda, and the group's headquarters in Afghanistan soon became the most politically important area of land on Earth. Iran issued its condolences publicly and privately, and while Khamenei did quietly point out that America had been largely indifferent to extremist attacks in Iran, he did show respect by temporarily suspending the usual chants of death to America. Iran was guided by both genuine sympathy and an understanding that it had to emphasize the difference between itself and the Muslims who had just declared war on America. The message was to be one of pure compassion and support, born both of real care and a shrewd reading of the global mood. Internally, however, Iran eyed the Afghan situation with growing concern. With an invasion of Afghanistan, the United States would put troops at the doorstep of the Islamic Republic, more than matching the threat of U.S. bases in Saudi Arabia. They also feared that the U.S. would destabilize the country, inserting chaos into the region and mooting decades of Iranian work to cement some sort of influence with the Taliban. Yet, as alarming as the inherently anti-American Persian government found this invasion, it also understood the American need for action and muted what would have otherwise been a loud denunciation. Iran had no love of Sunni extremists, or of the Taliban in particular, and was willing to wait and see how the United States would choose to move forward with its newly declared war on terror.
Our second goal is to prevent regimes that sponsor terror from threatening America or our friends and allies with weapons of mass destruction. Some of these regimes have been pretty quiet since September the 11th, but we know their true nature. North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger. I will not wait on events while dangers gather. I will not stand by as peril draws closer and closer. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons.
You know, it casts a long shadow even today over U.S.-Iran relations. At the time, Iran was actually helping the United States in the formation of a government in Afghanistan. And then, comes the Axis of Evil speech.
The so-called Axis of Evil speech was a watershed moment for the U.S.-Iran relationship and the beginning of a new age of prominence for neoconservatism. With this speech, the Bush administration made it clear that the war on terror would indeed stretch far wider than just al-Qaeda, putting Iran in the same league as North Korea and Iran's own hated enemy, Saddam Hussein. More than the invasion of Afghanistan itself, this speech galvanized the Iranian resistance to the new U.S. war on terror, and it severely undermined the younger, moderate Iranians who were calling for laxer rules and more engagement with the West. In America, however, there was a pressing question that needed to be addressed. Who would take over for the current regime if the Ayatollahs fell? America's influence in the country was exactly zero. They had no allies, no real sympathizers, and virtually no informants. Unlike in the past, they had no local with legitimacy to take over power. But there was still the MEK, or the People's Mujahideen of Iran. The dissident group had a smattering of followers in and out of Iran and spent significant amounts of money promoting the claim that they were the country's true leaders. Neoconservative groups looked at the MEK as a possible vehicle for a dramatic reorientation of the country, powered by a Khomeini-like triumphant return from exile. There was just one problem. Not only was the MEK widely rejected within Iran itself, but the U.S. had designated the group as a terrorist organization after its killings of U.S. citizens in the time of the Shah, and they continued to have a reputation for cult-like behavior toward their members. If the MEK was going to be the centerpiece of a neoconservative plan to oust the Iranian government, it was going to need to be rehabilitated. MEK made a major attempt to push for American action with what they hoped would be a bombshell announcement. Their agents inside Iran had acquired proof of the existence of a secret nuclear enrichment facility at Natanz, which US and EU intelligence almost certainly already knew about. By making the information public, MEC hoped to push the US to invade, but since it couldn't be proven how far along the facility actually was, the idea's enthusiastic backers in the Bush administration made little impact on the national mood. The MEC had been responsible for killing US citizens on several occasions. It would take more than a few aerial photos to expunge their designation as a terrorist group. At the same time, the US military held an enormous war game simulation called the Millennium Challenge, in which America took on a nameless red team clearly modeled after Iran. It was supposed to be a show of America's superior strength, but the American given command of Red Team, Lieutenant General Paul von Riper, took stock of his force and saw that he had many small, maneuverable ships that were difficult to pinpoint with targeting technology. He used these tiny, maneuverable boats to attack in unpredictable patterns, sending swarms of small rockets and missiles at the hulking American ships from close range. His force used World War II-era tactics to offset American technological superiority, sending messages by motorcycle courier and patterns of flashing lights, eventually incorporating simulated suicide attacks from small commercial boats. By the time von Riper's Red Team had killed a simulated 20,000 US personnel and sunk several of America's most expensive warships, the exercise was suspended. Blue Team was eventually refloated, and Red Team was forbidden from using unconventional tactics in war. Precisely the tactics that Iran likes best. It confirmed the Iranian narrative that America had no stomach for a war beyond distant aerial bombardments, and created an embarrassing failure for the US military just as it was trying to flex its muscles on the world stage. Clearly, the neocons would have a hard time convincing the American people of either the necessity or the ease of an invasion of Iran. And so they turned their attention back to the region at large, looking for a nation both worthy of toppling and realistically able to be toppled. The invasion of Iraq was the culmination of many threads of neoconservative thought: that America had to remove any actors defiant of its world order, that all peoples will naturally value national democracy over day-to-day stability, and that American power could easily pursue its interests to topple smaller governments with only minor consequences. Driven by their intuitive rather than evidence-based approach to understanding foreign countries, the neoconservatives assumed that Saddam had restarted his former programs for weapons of mass destruction and announced their existence on the assumption that they would be found after an invasion. In Iran, even those who had defended the US right to invade Afghanistan could not see the invasion of Iraq as anything but a major victory for an American worldview that had explicitly declared itself the enemy of Iran. And so, the invasion of Iraq killed any real pro-American momentum that may have existed in Iranian life, and certainly in Iranian politics. Nonetheless, many in the Iranian government viewed the invasion less as a setback than as an incredible opportunity. On the one hand, American soldiers now occupied territories on both sides of Iran, giving them ample strategic options for an invasion. On the other hand, not only was the United States toppling Iran's old historical rival for them, and eventually executing the man responsible for the deaths of so many of their young men, but predictable American missteps with regional groups seemed sure to bring opportunities for Iran to insert its influence over the majority Shia population.
But I think there were two sort of contradictory thoughts about it. One was, this United States is a bit like a wounded wild animal, and it's striking out all around us, and it's dangerous. It could strike at us too. But I think there was a contradictory thought as well, and it was that this is going to provide an opportunity to us. And so I think it was sort of beware, but be prepared to take advantage of the situation as it emerges. And that's precisely what happened.
With Saddam gone, the Iraqi Shia majority would presumably begin winning popular elections. And while Iraq's Arab Shia had nationalist and ethnic skepticism of Iran, they were sure to be friendlier than warlords like Saddam or the Sunni extremists he had always kept at bay. While Iran publicly denounced the US invasion as a father to chaos, it was at the very same time using its significant influence with the Iraqi Shia to undermine American plans and create that very chaos itself. Eventually, Iranian-backed militias began to not just harass patrols, but throw American force out of large portions of Baghdad, and the narrative in America began to shift in response. Iran was now a murderer of US soldiers, and local Iraqi fighters holding weapons bought with Iranian cash were framed as direct soldiers of the Iranian government. Local leaders like Muqtada al-Sadr put their militias at the command of Iranian agents, mostly Quds Force specialists from the IRGC, under the command of Qasem Soleimani. Soleimani made sure these groups knew they could rely on Iran for support, in particular funneling them endless numbers of IEDs, and coordinated their attacks with the help of Iranian national intelligence. Their success in fighting American troops to a standstill galvanized the national resistance, undermining the American narrative of easy victory in a grateful nation.
I think we saw with the 2003 invasion of Iraq, it's kind of the culmination of a lot of neoconservative dreams, if you will. A lot of people thought roses were going to be thrown at U.S. soldiers in the street and had some really delusional ideas about what would happen when we went into Iraq. I think if the Iraq invasion wasn't such a disaster, you would have seen probably them target Iran next.
They had a plan, which was to come up with a rationale which would allow them to use force, if necessary, to overthrow the Islamic Republic. And they were fully ready. There's no doubt about this. They were ready to use military force. And of course, the idea was that they would take Iraq first, and then when they consolidated control over Iraq, then they would target Iran. Of course, that didn't work the way they had planned.
Iran's dominance over the situation became so extreme that Soleimani once openly toured Baghdad's US-guarded green zone, prompting a debate among American officials about whether they could afford to arrest him. Eventually, they decided that it would cause too big an international incident and let him walk away unmolested. The completeness of this strategic victory, achieved via Iraqi proxies coordinated by the IRGC, cemented the Republican Guard as Iran's main method of confronting American power, and made Soleimani a uniquely hated figure in American intelligence circles.
Iranian influence is paramount in Iraq at the present time, and it's based on its control, most importantly, of coercive power. And that coercive power is in the form of a collection of militias. But if Lebanon is any example, as it should be, because it's the same modus operandi by Iran in Lebanon, over time, Hezbollah, with the backing of Iran, has been able to acquire more and more power. And now there is no significant Lebanese political actor who opposes Hezbollah because they know what awaits them. And that is basically liquidation either physically or politically.
Much like the world came to view every action of Hezbollah as an extension of Iranian will, so too did it come to see every dead American soldier as a victim of an Iranian proxy war.
At that time, they certainly had every reason to be concerned. We had just invaded Iraq, so we had several 100,000 troops on one border, and we were already in Afghanistan, so we had troops on another border. They certainly had every reason to at least be concerned that maybe the United States would take this all further. That never happened. It was never our intention to do that, but certainly I can see from their point of view the concern about it.
While America lost its soldiers to Iranian-made IEDs and Bush lost his approval rating at home, the Islamic Republic was continually cementing its influence with the American-backed Iraqi government. The White House was apoplectic at the borderline insanity of the situation, but backed down in the face of the reality that the US quite simply had no other options available. In 2004's Paris Agreement, even as US generals decried the need to work with Iranian agents who had recently trained their enemies, American officials opened negotiations on easing sanctions in exchange for a freeze on nuclear technology. America had no choice but to work with Iran both to govern the Iraqi Shia and to have any hope of actually ending the war in Afghanistan. Iranians eyed the geopolitical map with unease, but many also saw the potential for a very positive outcome for Iranian power: use Iraq and Afghanistan to bleed the American empire and set the stage to move into the vacuum of power left when they inevitably withdraw.
So this is as big a catastrophe in American policy decision-making as has occurred in American history. This ranks probably number one And so George Bush Jr. And all of those who contributed to that decision-making are equally guilty of a massive miscalculation and the horrible consequences for everyone except Iran as a result of it.
It seemed like a perfect opportunity. All the Persian people had to do to see this agenda through was keep their cool while enduring economic hardship and while watching the world slowly burn down around them. Instead, in the oppressive heat of August 2005, they elected Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Ahmadinejad had been the aggressively conservative mayor of Tehran, coming out of nowhere to trumpet a populist, highly religious message that the Islamic Revolution was alive and well. Khatami had been a potentially transformative figure, bringing a dogged belief that continued engagement with the world would eventually bear fruit for the Iranian people, that it was, in fact, the only thing that ever could. Instead, the era of dialogue among civilizations had ended with their country more reviled and more isolated than ever. To many, Khatami's calls for continued attempts at engagement began to sound like naivete, or worse, corruption to foreign power. On the other hand, Ahmadinejad cared little for international norms, brash and unskilled in regular politics, often making offensive statements and generally speaking for and to the less educated and less wealthy portions of the country.
Mr. Ahmadinejad has a big following in South Tehran, where people's greatest worry is unemployment. As mayor, he once went to a meeting in a dustman's uniform as a sign of solidarity.
Foreshadowing a growing movement in America, a previously voiceless conservative population saw their fortunes undermined time and again by the vagaries of global politics and global trade. And they responded by mobilizing for a protest candidate who offered fewer real solutions than opportunities for emotional catharsis. And so, Ahmadinejad, a newcomer to national politics but the candidate with the most extreme isolationist agenda, took power. And just as his supporters had hoped, his penchant for controversy forced the world to finally take notice of Iranian discontent. Ahmadinejad transformed Iran in the eyes of the public, making it harder for the country to benefit from any global assumption that Iran was being treated unfairly by an evil empire. He encouraged the religious right to reassert control over daily Iranian life, pushing policies that caused a large number of government employees to resign in protest, including a longtime liberal-leaning civil servant named Hassan Rouhani. His brash, populist form of religious extremism was irksome to the frowning religious intellectualism of Khamenei and the clerical class he represented, but as long as Ahmadinejad pushed for more conservatism, they would give his loudmouthed government some slack. With power now secured either forcefully or voluntarily, Ahmadinejad was free to reverse the impact of Khamenei's peace and love presidency, in particular ending Iran's prior nuclear agreements. He restarted nationwide nuclear enrichment and even had Iran's negotiators in 2004's Paris Agreement charged with treason. Perhaps most provocatively in the eyes of American Christians, Ahmadinejad also stoked hatred of Israel with provocative language about building a world without a Jewish state, paying only pathetic lip service to the distinction between Israel and Jewish people, and destroying Iran's long-standing place as one of the most multicultural states in the Muslim world. This was perhaps his most powerful appeal to the conservative Iranians who had elected him, who were tired of watching their leaders conform to international demands for politically correct language.
Obviously, he's a bit of an oddball. In a lot of ways, he's kind of similar to like Iran's Trump or something like that. Speaks off the cuff, does a lot of dumb things, but actually has like kind of this, populist kind of poor, base inside of Iran.
In Iran, we don't have homosexuals like in your country. We don't have that in our country.
Yeah, I think he made it extremely easy for U.S. policymakers to write off the possibility of serious negotiations, to rattle sabers against Iran, and really lean into conflict and ratchet up sanctions pressure.
Ahmadinejad's fan base reveled in the global horror as he implied that he, or perhaps all Muslims, would soon wipe Israel off the map. Perhaps even more worrying to Israel than his open anti-Semitism, however, were his repeated claims that Iran had the right to pursue a peaceful program of nuclear power, and his extremely suspect claims that Iran had no intention of reorienting this program toward the development of a nuclear weapon. Not even Iranians believed him, but they agreed with the subtext, that Iran should be negotiating to ease sanctions not just by offering to cease development of their nuclear program, but by threatening to expand it as well. Rather than bend, the US responded to Ahmadinejad's rhetoric by making regime change in Iran a matter of official national policy. American aggressiveness toward Iran did have the unintended consequence of making Iran more important to the designs of US rivals, leading Russia to invite Iran to join the CSTO, its regional military alliance and direct answer to NATO. Iran refused, but even the offer showed that America's rivals were still numerous enough to consider forming a new axis of their own, precisely what neoconservatism had set out to prevent. Meanwhile, neoconservatism itself was falling into ruin. With no weapons of mass destruction in sight, Iraq was a disaster that disproportionately killed young men from working-class families, a demographic that had always been the backbone of the conservative electorate. Going into the 2008 presidential election, the economic fortunes of most Americans meant that Bush had nothing to compensate for his missteps abroad, causing him and his party to drop to historically low levels of popularity. The neoconservative approach to international relations had been roundly rejected, yet the mainstream opposition voices seemed to believe in an almost identical vision of the world.
We would be able to totally obliterate them. That's a terrible thing to say, but those people who run Iran need to understand that.
John McCain emerged as the establishment attempt to keep neoconservative politics in power, but his hawkishness turned out to be less appealing to the American electorate than the political naivete of his widely relatable running mate. The US electorate was obviously eager to embrace any candidate who emphasized their differences from the political status quo, and soon enough, that candidate emerged.